review how to add and subtract rational expressions. So the other day we talked about finding least common denominators. Let's review our thinking on this just a bit. Let's look at how would we deal with something like, let's say we had 5 6 plus let's do 3 tenths. Okay. So what's the common denominator going to be?
It's 30.
30.
Nice.
Okay. And you don't even really need to think about, you can just think of it in terms of the smallest common multiple, can't you? You could just, you can just kind of think of multiples of 6 and multiples of 10 and pick the smallest one that overlaps, right? And that's probably what you do. But there's another way we could think about that. We could also look at the factors of these, right? And the only reason I'm doing this is because this kind of sets us up for how we want to think about adding rational expressions that use actual variables, right? Okay, let's put our phones and everything away, please. Completely away. I want your undivided attention here for the next 15 or 20 minutes, and then I'll let you work on this stuff. So what are the factors of 6, prime factors of 6? Okay, so we get a 2 and a 3. What about 10? Okay, so then how do we get that 30, right? Well, we need the least common denominator is going to be the smallest multiple of these factors, right? Of the factors 2, 3, and 5. Notice that the 2 appears in both of them, right? So really all I would have to do is multiply 2 times 3 times 5, which gives me 30. So what's the least common denominator? So then what do I have to multiply the 6 by? Okay, I want everybody please take a second and face the front. Actually face. There we go. Thank you. So if we're trying to get a 30 on the bottom of the 5 6, what do I have to multiply the bottom by?
3.
What times 6 is 30? 5. So I'd need a 5, wouldn't I?
Yeah.
Well, how come? Because I've already got a 2 and a 3, so the one I'm missing is the 5, right? That's the other factor that's not included. So any of the missing factors I need to multiply the bottom by, but I can't just multiply the bottom. I got to multiply top and bottom by the same thing. So I'm multiplying by 1, right? 5 over 5. How about over here? What do I need to multiply the bottom by to get 30? 3, okay. So I got to do the same thing to the top, because I've got the 2 and the 5, I just don't have the 3, right? So that's the same kind of thinking that we're going to carry forward into a problem like this, right? Where we're adding up these rational expressions. So first thing we got to do, just like before, is we've got to factor the denominators, right? So let's take this guy, the yellow fraction, and let's factor the denominator. Okay. First step in factoring an expression is always to try to do what? It's the first thing we always want to try to. It doesn't always work. We want to undistribute or factor out a GCF, right? A greatest common factor. So what can I factor out here? 2. So I could, the top just stays negative 11 on the bottom. I can undistribute or factor out a 2. What am I left with if I undistribute a 2?
Minus 5x plus 6.
Okay, so 2x squared divided by 2 is x squared. Negative 10x divided by 2 is negative 5x, and then 12 divided by 2 is 6, right? So we're left with that, plus, how about over here? We've got a 7 on the top. What can I factor out of the right denominator? 5, good. So if I factor out a 5, Gage, what am I left with if I factor out that 5? X squared, good. 4x, good. Plus 3. Okay, so let's go one step further with that then. If I split apart the denominator, it's a trinomial, right? I can find magic numbers and split that apart. What am I going to get over here? I've got my 2 already taken care of. Say it again. Okay. Negative 2 and negative 3. Now what helps here? I know that sometimes, you guys can do this pretty quickly, but sometimes when you jump to a conclusion on this, it might seem right, like in this case, the 6 and the 1, I could see where those would be numbers that you would be drawn to, but also 2 and 3. Well, which one? if you play the sign game, it really helps. If the numbers have to multiply to a positive and add to a negative, what are their signs? Yeah, they're both negatives, aren't they? I think that helps. That really helps. So then we end up with 2 and 3, right? Which you already told me. Okay, so then what about over here? So we've got the 7 on top. We've already got the 5 factored out of the bottom. What are the signs this time? Multiplying to a positive, adding to a negative. Both negatives. And what would they be? 1 and 3. Okay. So then what is going to be the least common denominator this time? So I'm going to I have to get the least common denominator of the numbers. What's the least common denominator with just the 2 and the 5, the least common multiple? 10, right? So I'm going to have a 10 for the number, the coefficient. Then I just have to have a list of factors that includes those 2, and it has to also make sure it includes those 2. What's that list going to be then? What's one factor that needs to be part of my LCD? X minus 2. Good, so took care of that one. We've already taken care of the 2 and the 5, right? What else? X minus 3. Okay, and that takes care of that. How about this? Do I need another x minus 3? Do not. Okay, that's shared factor, so we only need one of those. And then the last one? X minus 1. Okay. So then the question is, what do I need to multiply the yellow denominator by to get my least common denominator? I've already got a lot of it, right? What do I need? I need to multiply by a 5 because I need to get a 10, right? So I've got to multiply the bottom by 5, and then what else? What's the factor that is not included in the yellow denominator? It needs to be x minus 1. Okay, so I'm going to multiply both top and bottom by the same thing. 5 times the quantity x minus 1. Good. And that's going to give me the common denominator that I want on the bottom. That one, right? What about the green fraction? What am I missing from the green denominator? I need to get the least common denominator on the bottom. What do I need to multiply the bottom by? 2. 2 to get 10. And then which factor is missing? X minus 2. I'm going to do the same thing to the top and the bottom. And then what do I get? Okay, at this point, I've got a common denominator of 5 times 2. There's my 10. I've got my x minus 3, my x minus 2, and my x minus 1, right? What do I have on top? Well, there's my plus sign. Right? When we add up fractions, what do? We get a common denominator and then we add the numerators, right? So what is my left numerator? It's going to be this whole thing. Negative 11 times 5 times x minus 1. Well, negative 11 times 5 is negative 55 times x minus 1, right? Plus the right numerator. Well, what does that simplify to be? 14 times the quantity x minus 2, right? So all I've got to do then, at this point, is just simplify the top, right? So what's that give me if I simplify the top here? If I distribute, isn't this whole part right here just going to be negative 55x plus 55? Would you agree? How about over here? If I distribute the 14,
and then negative 28.
so I just have to add up, and I'm just adding those two, right? So I just have to add up like terms. So negative 55x plus 14x is what? Negative 41x, good. And then 55 plus negative 28 is that? 27? Okay, so that's my answer, right? Do we need to expand the bottom out? Well, not unless they tell us to, right? I mean, if it tells us to write this as a rational function in standard form where both of them are polynomials, then yeah, we could, but I don't think I made you do that, right? So we could even just leave it like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so last part of this then, the last part. So that's our answer. There's two parts to this. We want to know, this one is asking you to write the simplified rational function, okay? Which we did. There's another question you're going to be asked separately, which is, for a problem like this, if you're finding the sum, what's the domain? Meaning, what are the excluded values, right? The domain would be everything except the values that would make the bottom 0. In other words, except the zeros of the bottom. So if we go back and look at this stage right here, where we had, just focus on just the yellow fraction and the green fraction. Before we even did anything, right? Before we did any of the math associated with adding this up, getting a common denominator, we could have just looked at the zeros of the yellow fraction, and what are they? 2 and 3. Everybody agree? Okay, so that's telling us that x, this tells us that x cannot equal 2 and x cannot equal 3, right? Because for that yellow fraction to be defined, you can't divide by 0, so we have to exclude those x values. What about the green fraction? What values do we need to exclude there? Can't equal 1, and x can't equal 3, but we already had the 3, didn't we? Right? So combined, then, what's the domain?
Maybe 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, x just can't equal 1, x can't equal 2, and x can't equal 3. That's it. That's the easiest way to write it. I'm going to let you write it that way. If you wanted to write it like an interval notation, we'd have to write all the intervals surrounding those, those values. We have to take those values out. But we don't need to do that. We just write it this way to get the idea, right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, have at it. The 9.1 assignment is up, ready to go. Okay, I want you to do, before you do anything else, I want you to do at least one. Oh, by the way, I didn't do a subtraction problem, but isn't it exactly the same thing? Instead of adding, the only difference would have been, instead of adding this, we just would have distributed a negative sign through it added, right? So you got to do at least one addition problem and one subtraction problem in the chapter 9 assignment, 9.1 assignment, then you can do whatever.